Thank you. If I could have the lights down. First slide is up there to keep your attention while I give you a little bit of initial philosophy on UFO photos. After many years of this business, I began to realize that a photo does not a UFO make. There's got to be an awful lot behind it. It may be that a single photo or several still photos could turn up in which there is undisputed photographic evidence that it could not have been faked, but I doubt it. My guess is that any photo or any series of photos could be faked given enough time, effort, and technological capability. It would be more difficult with a movie or a videotape, but even then, once you are or I am presented with a photo, I often sit down and ask myself, how could it be done? And so I go through a lot of straw man analysis, saying, well, suppose it was done this way, what would the results be? Would it look like that photo? Suppose it was done another way, would the results look like a particular photo? Generally, I can come up with a way, I can imagine a way to synthesize the photo. If you grant that any photo could be hoaxed, then ultimate proof can't rely on the photos themselves. And in fact, photos are sort of like hard evidence. A lawyer once told me that in a court of law, a criminal case is often not based on the physical evidence itself because the, quote, hard facts can often be refuted by the experts. The case is built on circumstantial evidence. Who, what, why, where, how, when, etc. All the questions that go into, in this case, the taking of the photograph, the background, and so on. What I'm going to do is give you a discussion of optics and photography sort of in general, and then talk about some UFO hoaxes or photographic mistakes, let's say, and then some actual cases I've worked on. Now, how many people here have heard of a small town of 3,000 people in northwestern Florida called Gulf Breeze? I don't know whether I'll get to any slides on Gulf Breeze or not. I understand that John said he's going to be showing the NBC documentary that was done a couple of nights ago. Many of you may have seen that. I have a videotape which might also be shown, which shows a documentary by WEAR-TV in Pensacola last March, a couple of other news items that WEAR did in April and June, and some backup footage, plus the actual December 28th videotape shot by Mr. Ed of Gulf Breeze. If I have time, I will show some of the slides. I have enough slides to do an hour or so lecture just on that one case itself. Perhaps a 2-hour lecture just on that one case itself. Whether time would allow that sometime or not between now and the end of Sunday, I don't know. Anyway, here is a photograph of a genuine unidentified object. And you can see the unidentified object is just to the right of the genuine identified object, which happens to be the sun during a solar eclipse. And the unidentified object is just to the right. It just happened to fly by. Unfortunately, I didn't see it when I took the photo, but there it popped up in the film, so it must be real, right? Well, it certainly is a real image. It's not a superimposition. It's not a double exposure. The structure of the image, however, immediately gives itself away to somebody who is familiar with problems in photography, and that's known as a lens flare. Why isn't it going forward? There we go. First of all, let's get a little fundamental physics and optics in hand. If you see an object at varying distances as it moves away from you, a bird, for example, when it's close up, you can see enough resolution. You can see it with enough resolution, which is a term you should remember. Enough resolution so that you can see the outline, you can see the shape, you can tell whether it's a bird or plane or Superman, and reject one of those as appropriate. As it gets farther and farther away, it gets so small that you can't resolve its shape. Your eyeball just plain can't see detail of a bird, for example, at a mile or so. Same thing happens with a camera. If an object gets so far away, sufficiently far away, you can't resolve the detail. The angular size of an object is the angle that it subtends, the angle that the apparent size to the observer. Walt mentioned that just in his previous talk when he talked about holding a several-inch ruler up at arm's length. A fixed size object like 1 foot viewed at various distances, like 3 feet, 10 feet, and 100 feet in this diagram, makes a continuously smaller angle as it gets farther and farther away. The idea of resolution is that you can see detail of objects determined by how many what we call resolution elements that lie on top of the object. On the right-hand picture there, you have 1 resolution element, and you can only see that you've got an object. On the left-hand side, you have 8 resolution elements in size. A resolution element is sort of the smallest thing that you could see with any detail at all. So you can judge your capability to resolve an object, determine its shape, by its angular size. If somebody says he saw a little teeny black dot off on the horizon, and oh yes, there were windows and an alien waving at him, you know immediately that there's an inconsistency. Whereas if he said, well, it seemed to be as big as a house, and you could see an alien and windows and aliens waving at him, then at least it's self-consistent in terms of the apparent size of the object. Going now to photography. Photography basically is 2 things called photogrammetry and photometry. Photogrammetry is the study of angles and the sizes of images on the film, and photometry is the brightness. The camera does a very neat thing, same thing that your eyeball does. It forms a little picture on a film plane, a little picture that happens to be inverted of the real world, and for practical purposes there is just a simple ratio between the outside, the real world out there, and the picture on the inside of the camera. The camera lens acts like a vertex of 2 triangles which join at the camera lens. Photometry is the relative brightness of objects. Photometry becomes important in some investigations where you want to know how bright an object was from how bright the image it made is, and there's a big complicated equation for calculating that, assuming you can make lots of simplifying assumptions. In a 2-dimensional format, which is a camera photograph or a videotape, you can infer 3-dimensional information from shading. Here I've drawn a 2-dimensional picture of a sphere on top of a block, and if you knew that the sun were in a certain, or the light source were in a certain location, you could infer 3-dimensionality from the brightness variation across the image of this sphere. Whenever you look at something at a distance, or whenever you photograph something at some distance, and in particular photographing, you get distortion setting in. The atmosphere gives you a problem sometimes. The camera lens can give you a problem having to do with shape and brightness of the object. Film grain, that is actual little sensitive portions of the film. They're very tiny, but they set a minimum resolution that any film could register. Then there are other problems with film defects, dirt on the lens, relative motion, printing, that is making the final picture, and the ultimate distortion is that the picture you get is flat. It's a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional world out there. Sometimes it's important to know how the film density or how the brightness of the image on the film changes with respect to exposure level, how many photons or how much light has actually hit the film. Edge distortion can be an indicator of great distance sometimes, if you can analyze it sufficiently well, but there's an edge distortion just due to film grain. If you photograph the edge of a building from a long distance away, you know that that edge is very sharp. However, on the film, it's going to look like it's not very sharp, even if the camera is perfectly focused. terms of retrieving information from film, you can get you can do this partially, but you can't always do it perfectly. The ultimate problem, of course, is in the film grain itself if you took away all the other problems. Image processing is an attempt to get around the problems of photography using edge enhancements, color contouring to look at brightness variations in the image, spatial filtering, contrast enhancement, and you have measuring instruments to do that. But the bottom line about photography is that you get out less than you put in. There are all sorts of effects competing with the actual information which was recorded. The competition between these, the recording process and the information itself means that the information gets degraded. Okay, now here is a photograph that I took of literally zillions of spherical UFOs flying around outside my car one day when I was driving along. Don't laugh, I have been asked to analyze photos like this. However, I focused the camera after that shot, and lo and behold, that's what I was looking at. Red and white and green and so on UFOs turned out to be highly defocused images. Now, you couldn't see any of the things like the road or the poles holding lamps up in the defocused images. All you could see were the very bright things, which made circles. Now, here is another case where there's a UFO off on the left-hand side of the road there. That's another lens flare. Whenever you have a very bright light in the field of view of the camera, or even if the bright light shines on the lens of the camera, you can get structured images on the film which are not actual images of anything out in the real world, but actually due to reflections of light within the camera. Here's a really professionally done UFO. I was riding along on a bus on the Northway up in New York, and I looked to my right, and lo and behold, here was a UFO traveling along with me, and to my great amazement, sometimes it would appear far away, and sometimes it would appear to be between me and the trees that were a few hundred feet away. And so I took a photograph of this UFO out through the window of the bus. And then I turned around and I took a photograph in the other direction. Photos of reflections in windows. Now, this could be considered to be a superimposition. This is not a double exposure, but this is a bright object reflected off glass. I photographed the background. You can see the background trees. This is one of the hypothetical methods, for example, it's been argued that the photographer in Florida used. Life magazine back in 1967 or 68 did a big spread on UFOs, and they included a bunch of pictures of UFOs from all over the place, and you can see down the bottom left-hand corner is a typical situation of ceiling lights reflected in a window, and you take a photograph looking outdoors, so you can see the power lines and so on, and you see the ceiling lights reflected in the window. Similar sort of thing could have occurred in the upper one, except that the upper one is actually a photograph of a puddle of water with bubbles in it. That photograph is upside down. It looks kind of interesting, doesn't it? The upper right-hand corner. Here's the Eiffel Tower with some extraterrestrial visitors, another situation where you have reflections in a window. And here's the ultimate UFO bursting over Washington, D.C. on the 4th of July. Now, can you spot the UFO in this picture? Yeah. I can actually absolutely verify this. This picture definitely shows a real object, not too far from my house, right under that tree, for example. And in fact, it stayed there long enough so that I could get another picture from another view, and you can even see 3 black spots, which were supposed to be legs on the bottom. In fact, they look like black spots. You can't see the depth to them. That's simply a little model hanging beneath a string, hanging from a string beneath the branch up there. And I had done this in order to test whether or not I could determine whether or not there was a string up above it. In that situation, I was able to actually see the string for some distance away, but ultimately it got the camera got so far away that I couldn't see the string. If I had been very clever and I had matched the color of the string to the color of the background sky, then it wouldn't have mattered what distance I shot it from. I wouldn't be able to see the string. Film can only pick up contrast in brightness, contrast in color, one or the other. But if you have two things, one next to the other, and they both look exactly the same, then they're going to look exactly the same. You won't be able to tell where the edge is. Now let's go to authentic photographs of a flying saucer, according to a newspaper in McMinnville, Oregon, June 11, 1950. Or June 8, 1950, I guess it was. But anyway, the photos were taken on May 11th. This has been the subject of much of my early work, starting in 1975. This is the famous Paul and Evelyn Trent case, McMinnville, Oregon, 1950. It was featured in the Condon report as being the only case that William Hartman, the photographic analyst, was tentatively willing to back. He said all factors investigated seemed to be consistent with the claim of the witnesses that a strange, extraordinary flying object had passed within their sight of some many meters in size. He had done a photometric analysis as well as a photogrammetric analysis and determined a size for the object. When I got into the Trent investigation, I expected I'd be able to show that Hartman was wrong, but in fact, over literally many years of study of the pictures, and I managed to get a hold of the original negatives to work with and had them analyzed and so on. I'll show you some of the results here. I concluded that yes, you could have hoaxed this photo. The real question then became, is it consistent with what we know about the witnesses to say that they could have hoaxed a photo? And the most straightforward comment in regard to the capability of the witnesses came from the man who published the pictures in the newspaper, the news reporter who first went out and got the photos from the Trents. He talked to them for some period of time, asking them about the story and so on. And when I interviewed him in 1978, I guess it was, 28 years after the event, he said that he had concluded that they couldn't have been a hoax because they were too stupid. Here is a larger version of one of the more important of the two pictures. You can see the bottom of the object there, an oval shape. Based on my reconstruction, where did that pointer get to? Based on my reconstruction and making use of the angular size of the object and its angular elevation.
Microphone, please.
Oh, because you want to tape. Yes, I know. Making use of the angular size of the object as measured on the film and the angular elevation. The angular elevation or angular altitude, I might mention that when Walt was talking to you before, he talked about asking a witness about what the altitude of an object was. The ordinary people think of altitude as an actual number in feet or meters. What Walt was really referring to was the angular altitude. You should never ask a witness how high he thinks an object was, because he's going to have to make a guess. Ask him what angle it was up with respect to the horizon. That's the correct question. Anyway, based on the film, I concluded that if the object were as far away as a kilometer, for example, it had gone in an arc like this, probably, with respect to the Trent's house, which is right here on a road. McMinnville, Oregon is a little town right up there on that road. Here are excellent blow-ups, actually done by the Air Force, of the first photo, the second photo and the first photo right here. This shows that the object was not completely symmetric. The pole was off-center, the thing on the top was off-center and tilted backwards slightly. And a careful study of the bottom of that led me to conclude that it might not even have been perfectly round, but actually had a little bit of a non-round shape to it on one side. Here is an indication of the type of sophisticated analysis that can be done. These photos were looked at by the late Ground Saucer Watch, Bill Spaulding, who was, I presume, not the late Bill Spaulding, but the organization appears to have gone underground, and at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. No one was able to find any indication of a suspension for the object, even though it appears underneath wires. And of course, the simplest hoax hypothesis would be that they simply hung a model under the wires that go over the picture. If I back up far enough here, you see the wires up above. Now, the Trent story was that Mrs. Trent saw this object while she was out in the morning feeding the rabbits. She was walking back to the house. She saw the object approaching from the north. She ran, called her husband, and one of them ran, and she couldn't remember which, ran and got the camera. In any event, he got the camera into his hand somehow, ran out in the back of his house, and took 2 pictures. By using photogrammetric techniques, I was able to reconstruct the backyard of the Trent's house, having many conversations with her and having the photographic data to work with. This became the corner of their house, and here's the garage. Where the wires were was determined by the actual size, the location of the house and size of wires and all sorts of tricky things that you get into. Who would suspect that in order to analyze a UFO photo, you had to know what the thickness of wire with insulation would be if installed in 1947 or 48. At any rate, the operational question here was, if it was a model object hanging underneath the wire and just sort of swinging there while he photographed it, then you would expect the sighting lines from his 2 locations, here and here, to cross underneath the wire. Well, I could determine easily where the sighting lines crossed once I had set up this diagram. I simply plotted his positions, and with respect to true north, I knew the sighting line to the first object for the first photo and the sighting line for the second photo. Actually, it goes 1, 2, like that. The sighting lines crossed right here. And so the next question was, where did the wires go over? And it turned out that there were 2 possible sizes for the wire, and those 2 possible sizes for the wire corresponded to wire crossing locations here and here, which is not where the sighting line crossed. If the wires had gone right over the sighting line, this would have been too much of a coincidence to swallow. But in fact, the wires didn't go over the sighting line. So I didn't, in effect, prove that it was a hoax. Many years after I had done this analysis leading to this picture here, we actually got agricultural survey pictures, aerial photographs, which provided a picture of the Trent's house from above, and I was very gratified to find that I was off by about 1 foot in that spacing, essentially the resolution of the agricultural survey map photo. One argument against the Trent photos had to do with the appearance of shadow underneath the edge of the roof. This is the edge of a roof on the east side of a barn. Now, the Trents claimed that the photos had been taken in the evening. One skeptic claimed that the only way these shadows could have been made was by the sun in the morning. Therefore, the Trents had turned the time around, and then they went through a long discussion of why the Trents might have taken photos in the morning and then said they were taken in the evening. Anyway, I tested the hypothesis that it was the sun. This is a problem for both photogrammetry and photometry. If the sun is up here illuminating the wall past the edge of the roof, then it creates a region down below here sees the whole illumination of the sun. A region up above the shadow sees no illumination from the sun. There is a gradient region where you go from no illumination to total illumination. Throughout that gradient region, you have partial illumination. And you can calculate how big this gradient region should be, actually in inches, on the surface of the wall. So I did that. Here is another diagram of the same thing, the width of the light source, the width of the gradient region. Now, you would expect a continuous variation in brightness as you go from the completely shaded part to the completely bright part. You don't usually think of this in terms of sunlight. You think of sharp shadows and so on. But if you look at the shadow of a building being illuminated by the sun, you will find that the edge of the building is, in fact, diffuse. here's another drawing. Now what I was looking for was a sharp gradient characteristic of the sun versus a gradual gradient characteristic of something that had a large angular size compared to the sun. In order to determine how big the angular size of the sun was, everybody knows it's half a degree, but few people in the world, in fact I might be the only one, and now I'll let you on the secret, the effective angular size of the sun from the point of view of making shadows actually grows a little bit with cloud cover. So I had to use a special device to measure that, and I generated a graph showing how bright the surface was, the relative brightness of the surface, and the effective width of a shadow. Then I used a device known as a microdensitometer, a scanning microdensitometer, to actually measure the gradient region. Here's the gradient region on that shadow. Turned out to be effectively a specific number of inches in size on the wall of the garage. And the upshot of the matter was that number of inches was about 5 or 6 times greater than you would expect if the sun had made the shadow. The implication the other way around was that the size of the gradient region implied that some very large angular size light source had made the shadow rather than the sun. And it was conjecture, of course, that a bright cloud in the east in the evening could have done that. It was conjecture until I actually saw it happen in Florida in '76, I believe. And then a year or so later, when I was at home in Maryland, a situation set itself up where there was, in fact, this bright cloud on the east side of my house at sunset, and I held my finger up against my hand, and lo and behold, I could see the shadow of my finger on my hand, so I ran and got my camera. Unfortunately, by the time I had taken this picture and this one, the conditions had worsened somewhat, because it took me 4 or 5 minutes or so to set up the experiment, as it were, to document the situation. But here is a shadow of this board, a shadow coming down here, made by a bright cloud to the east. And so it was a situation that the shadow under the garage roof and the shadow under my roof could have been made. Well, I know the shadow under my roof was made by a bright cloud, the implication being there could have been a bright cloud east of the Trent farm at that time. In fact, the weather report said that there were scattered cumulus clouds in the region. Here's another photo that's often associated with the Trent photo. I was never able to locate the original of this thing. Nobody knows where it was. This is actually taken in 1957, according to the Royal Air Force Flying Review. I contacted the guy who wrote the first article that ever published this picture in June. It was published in June of 57, I should say. This is not just a copy of the Trent photo. This object is seen in a slightly different perspective. It is, however, sufficiently similar so it would appear to be the same sort of object, but viewed at a different angle. Here's a picture that I haven't analyzed, taken by a writer and deputy sheriff by the name of Arthur Strout in, I think, 1965. I have included this one because it's one of the few photos endorsed by Mr. Klass. Yes, that's right, I did say the K word. In his first book. How many people have read Mr. Klass's first book? How many people have read any of Mr. Klass's books? Well, he's the major debunker in this area, but in his first book, he accepted the idea that there was really something unusual going on, and he thought that this maybe might have been a plasma. Makes a very interesting picture. As I said, it's interesting because of its essential endorsement some 20 years ago by Funny Phil. Here's some other pictures I haven't been able to analyze because I haven't been able to get the original negatives, but these are interesting pictures to look at. Trinidad Island, 1957, taken by a photographer on board the ship. It was claimed that these were all hoax photos done by a superposition or double exposure method. However, the people witnessed him taking the photos, and the photos were developed right on board under the supervision of the naval officers. There were multiple witnesses to the object at the same time that the guy photographed it, so it's exceedingly difficult to imagine These are little blow-ups of the actual size thing right here. This is a blow-up. Here's a better picture. It has a rim along the center and a top and a bottom, almost like a squashed sphere with a rim through it. Your standard flying bowls, lip to lip. Here's a photo, well, this is a photo case in which nobody doubts the veracity of the photographers. The Gemini 11 astronauts, September 1966, were flying along in their little Gemini capsule, minding their own business. All of a sudden, they saw this flashing light approaching them, and it went so close to their spacecraft that they were able to take a picture of it. Now, for objects that pass close to you as you're driving along the road or something is a very common occurrence, right? But when you're in outer space, when you're 200 and some miles up, the distances between objects there are typically measured in the hundreds or thousands of miles. So for something to come within a few miles of you is a rare occurrence. The astronauts, of course, always hope that anything coming within a few feet of them is an exceedingly rare occurrence, because at the speeds that, the differential speeds that objects move at up there, something like a BB could go right through the spacecraft, making a hole through anything that it happened to pass through. So this is a situation where we have totally authentic photos. This was discussed in the Condon report and stated to be photos of a Soviet rocket booster. And that really became the bone of contention here. Was this a photo of a known spacecraft, a known satellite or something, or was this something unusual? This picture shows a very bright glow on the left-hand side, which is a highly overexposed image of light reflected off a UHF antenna that's attached, an antenna attached to the spacecraft. And just to the right, you see this little bright image. Here's another photo. There were actually 4 photos taken, and 2 of them showed enough detail on this thing to make it worthwhile blowing up. Here's one of them. I don't know why one of them didn't show. There. These photos are taken some number of seconds apart. There's not enough detail on this image to say that you can say anything other than there was an outline. The image is totally exposed here. It's overexposed. When you overexpose film, you can't really say anything about what the structure was in here. All you can say is that it had a general outline with a bright thing here, and there was some sort of a gap between bright areas there. This makes it look like there were several smaller, bright things reflecting light towards the camera, and all you've been able to see are big globs. Brad Sparks and I independently, well, we worked together, but we independently calculated that over a several-year effort, that the Soviet spent rocket, that it was claimed that this thing was a Soviet rocket, okay, and we concluded that this rocket was 3,200 miles behind the Gemini 11 at the time, whereas they were photographing forward in this direction, something that would have been within a few miles of them. Even the not-so-late, not-so-great James Oberg had to admit that he wasn't able to identify this particular thing right here. We don't know what it was. If it was a satellite, it was one that NORAD either wasn't tracking or they weren't telling us about, or it wasn't a satellite. Now here's a UFO that used to run around my house. Okay, now we take a trip down to New Zealand. Coming up on the 10th anniversary of the New Zealand sightings, December 31st, 1978. Those sightings made national news because a TV crew was involved, and shortly after the sightings, the TV station put together a little documentary and sold it around the world. It even took up Walter Cronkite on January 2nd, 1979, devoted the last 10 minutes or so of his evening news show to showing a little portion of that documentary and having a discussion, instantaneous discussion by the experts as to what what had happened. Something funny about that projector. This is a picture of the area. There was a plane flying along New Zealand. I know the picture that's missing is a map of New Zealand. I don't know why it won't fall down. But anyway, if you can envision in your mind where New Zealand is down there near Australia, this is what you would see if you were flying along the east coast of the South Island of New Zealand, a very mountainous area. Here is a blow-up of the situation. Now, the New Zealand sightings took place over a period of time of about 3 hours. And when I did my investigation, I found that I talked to 8 first-hand witnesses to events that involved not only witnesses on the airplane and 16mm color movie, but tape recording made on the airplane, a tape recording made at the Wellington, New Zealand Air Traffic Control Center. All this information had to be analyzed and correlated. It literally took years to do. There were reports on the investigation in MUFON Journal and International UFO Reporter starting in the spring of '79. There have been 2 books written by people who are actually witnesses. The pilot wrote a book on it. The reporter from Australia wrote a book on it. Robert Schaefer and Mr. Klass had chapters on this in their books. Mr. Klass's 1983 book and Schaefer's, I think, is in '82. So there's been a lot of stuff written about it, and this one particular case, could be several-hour discussion by itself. I don't have time to go into all of that. Let me just say that on December 20th and 21st of 1978, there were sightings in this area off the coast of New Zealand. And those sightings made news headlines in New Zealand and Australia. Now, Australia was sensitized to UFOs because it was only October. As a matter of fact, this is almost exactly the 10th anniversary of the disappearance of Frederick Valentich in October 1978, flying a little plane south from Melbourne. And what makes that interesting from the UFO point of view is that he described some oddball object flying back and forth over his small aircraft. He was talking to the air traffic controllers, and then all of a sudden he stopped talking to the air traffic controllers, and nothing was ever found. So Australia was sensitized to UFO reports. Then in December, along come these New Zealand sightings, which caused a big flurry of excitement in New Zealand and Australia. And over the Christmas holiday, Australia reporter was having a holiday in New Zealand, and his station called him up and said, "Why don't you do some background footage on the New Zealand sightings about 10 days ago, and we will show it over the New Year's Day holiday." So this reporter, whose name was Quentin Fogarty, managed to get a hold of a cameraman and sound recordist, people he had never met, and he went and interviewed some of the people who were involved in the previous sighting. He also managed to wangle himself a trip on one of the aircraft that had been involved in the previous sightings. And his intent was to get on the aircraft and have himself filmed inside the aircraft saying, "We're flying along the same path as they did 10 days ago. We're going to keep our eyes open." And he, in fact, did that. He, of course, the pilot and the co-pilot knew each other. The sound recordist was the wife of the photographer, so they knew each other. But Fogarty, the reporter, didn't know any of the people on board, and the photographer didn't know the air crew, and so on. So basically, it was a bunch of strangers. As the plane, now this was a freighter aircraft flying on a Saturday night to deliver Sunday newspapers, flying from Wellington, New Zealand, down to Christchurch, New Zealand. And this was a standard flight where they would leave just before midnight and land about 1 o'clock in the morning down here, unload newspapers from the loading bay. It's a large freighter type of aircraft known as an Argosy. The camera crew was down in the belly of the plane photographing Quentin. Up in the cockpit, the pilot and the co-pilot, who had flown this trip many times before, were flying along this track and starting to turn to the left here a little bit. And they noticed in this area, the so-called Clarence River area, that there were bright lights that would appear and seem to beam down a beam and then go off, and then appear somewhere else and beam down a beam and then go off. After watching this for a couple of minutes, the pilot called up the Wellington Aircraft Control Center and asked if they had any targets in that area. And immediately Wellington came back and said, yes, we have targets in that area, and started giving distances and directions, and the directions matched. From where the plane was, the targets would have been down in this direction, but not as far away as the pilot had thought. In any event, this correlation between visual and radar really began a series of events. The pilot invited the crew up, the news crew up, not saying what was out there, but simply come up and look outside. Over a period of time, they witnessed lights were apparently close to the object. The radar, the ground radar reported objects that were within a few miles of the aircraft, some of them even appearing directly in front of the aircraft. The cameraman shot some film during this trip south. One section of film shows a bright light, which is sort of an oval thing, and it changes its shape in time, and then it comes on and goes off, and comes on and goes off. It sort of flashed on and off 3 times. There is no way that he could have gotten this blue light from filming inside the aircraft. His film, in fact, confirms the pilot's statement that they had turned the cockpit lights down to a very dull reddish glow, just enough to be able to see the meters. And there were no blue lights. They were 20 miles off the coast. The cameraman tried to film the coast. You can just barely see a hazy coastline. The closest lights were 20 miles away. Nothing bright enough to make this size of an image. So what was it? Well, it was an unidentified bright image on a film, but since you know where the film was taken from, you may as well say it was an unidentified flying object. It was definitely outside the airplane, which was doing about 250 miles an hour at the time. A whole series of events occurred as they flew south that became quite hair-raising, with the ground traffic controller reporting an object to the right-hand side of the aircraft when they were flying south in this area. And the crew actually looked out, and they could see a flashing light out there, and the reporter even recorded in real time his impression of this flashing light that was traveling along with the aircraft. And then that flashing light apparently stood still, and the aircraft flew on. They landed at Christchurch and decided to go back. The plane had to fly a reverse route up to a place called Blenheim and dump off the rest of the newspapers, and then that would be the end of the airplane's flight. So the crew had originally planned to just fly to Christchurch and get off. However, because of these events, they decided to go back. And in fact, the sound recordist's wife, the cameraman's wife, was too spooked to go back. She got off, and Quentin Fogarty invited another reporter, a guy from Christchurch, to actually get on the plane in place of David Crockett was the cameraman, his wife, get on board in her place and fly north with them. So they flew north out of Christchurch. They saw a bright light immediately clearing as they cleared the clouds. They saw a bright light just off to the right, and that sort of stayed there, and they watched this thing for 10 minutes. The cameraman got about 10 minutes of film on this one object. The plane was climbing up to a standard altitude of about 13,000 feet, and the pilot and co-pilot decided that if they got up there, when they got up to altitude, they would actually turn towards the object to see what would happen. I guess that sounds like a gutsy thing to do. That's what this little zigzag here is. It probably should go down like this and then sort of more up like that, right straight back. But in any event, they did turn towards it. It appears to have moved in response to their turn that allowed the cameraman to get closer footage. This particular section has been called the squid boat section because the only conceivable explanation is that they filmed a solitary squid boat sitting here. And of course that then, you can test the squid boat hypothesis, and it has been tested, and I'll show you the results. After they left this area, flying north, the object seemed to disappear behind them eventually. I can describe about that, but in any event, north of here, they had another sighting. As they're flying along this track, all of a sudden there appeared in front of them a cluster of lights that was flashing. It was confirmed on radar, as a matter of fact, ground radar. Oh, and down here they had this object on the airplane radar. But anyway, ground radar confirmed an object up here, and this turned out to be a flashing light on the film, a periodic flash of about once per second. That's what you see when you look at the film running in normal speed. You slow it down, look frame by frame, you see considerable structure. This portion of the film, according to Mr. K-Word, is a reflection of the red beacon on top of the aircraft, and I'll discuss that. Here is one of literally hundreds of frames you could look at during the portion of the film taken just north of Christ Church. Here is another image, very bright yellowish, round. Here is still another image. One portion of the film, the cameraman steadied the camera on the back seat of the co-pilot's chair and got a very steady round image with a little green dot at the end of it. Here it is right here, a little green nub sticking out. Okay, now this is claimed to be the photo of a squid boat about 10 to 15 miles distance. Squid boat sitting in the water. Squid boats turn on very bright lights at night in order to lure squid up to the surface where they can catch them in their nets. This is primarily the Japanese squid fleet that goes down into New Zealand waters to catch squid. Here is a genuine photo of a genuine squid boat taken from the same aircraft with a similar camera, but a still camera as opposed to a movie camera, 200 millimeter focal length lens and so on. The guy in the movie could use a telephoto lens. Okay, observe, anybody who has looked at lights from boats from the air knows that there's a reflection in the water that appears below the boat itself. This image is smeared by camera motion to some extent, but you do see, extending downwards from the bright spot where the boat was, this reflection going downwards. Now here's a poor composite situation where I tried to put two slides onto the same screen and photograph them both. This round image and the squid boat image. And go back and look at this round one. I have searched diligently for any indication of light underneath this bright thing here. It could be light reflected in the water, and I have found no indication of any light reflected in the water. Now a squid boat could do that. If you get the light high enough above the water, then the reflection in the water will be outside your field of view. In this case, any squid boat flying above 3,000 feet could have netted lots of squid without producing a reflection. So much for squid boats. The next portion of the film shows a flashing light. I don't have 200 and some frames of a flashing light. This particular portion of the film is a subject of a paper published by the Society for Scientific Exploration in their Journal of Scientific Exploration. The second issue just came out last spring. 40 pages of analysis, complete with sketches of almost every frame in the film, and discussion of explanations as well as technical data. Here I'm only going to show you a couple of frames. You have very bright white images like this. They happen to be sausage-shaped there because the camera was not steady. It was moving around, and that tends to streak the images. So ignore the overall shape. The best images in the film show that the source was round, or the very bright images are basically round, not shaped like that. You get images which are a mixture between a sort of a yellowish and a red. And several times in the film, now the camera moves back and forth and vibrates. Every vibration has a period of time when there is no motion. At the left and right ends of the swing of a pendulum, for example. For a period of time, the pendulum is not moving. As the camera swings back and forth, this causes a distortion known as motion smear. But if you can go frame by frame in a movie and watch the image as a function of position on the movie screen, you can see that the image might be moving to the left and then reverse and go back to the right. If that happens, the time of reversal is when the camera was stationary or nearly stationary. So these are images which I've picked to what I would call stationary images, as if the camera were being held on a tripod as opposed to sitting on the guy's shoulder, which is the actual situation. We get these little images here, which, when on fine analysis, have two red dots at the bottom and an orange dot on the top, a triangular shape. So if you can imagine looking at this thing, you would see very bright white shrinking down to a little triangular image and then expanding up to a very bright white. That's the way the image would sort of look if it were a steady image on the film. And as I said, a regular rate of once per second. Here is a graph showing this regularity. Here's a photograph. This happens to be the pilot. Up on top of the aircraft is a red beacon, standard thing for aircraft. 1 second, one flash per second as you're sitting here, if you were sitting here, look at it. Inside the cockpit is where the people were, of course, up here. And here are the propellers. The propellers play a role in this hypothetical explanation. This is a view outside one of the windows showing what the propeller looks like on the ground. Now the cameraman took film of that airplane before the whole trip started. Cameramen always have this penchant for running some film in their camera before they do what they're supposed to be doing. So he filmed the airplane from the tarmac, and he got film of this actual light right up there. If you look very carefully at this image, you'll see that it's red around the outside and got a yellow center. Here's a bigger view of it, a yellowish center and red around the outside. This is an overexposed image on color film of a red light. Whenever you photograph a red light or a blue light or a green light, if you do not overexpose, you get the proper color, which would be red, green, or blue. If, however, there is so much light coming into the camera that the film is saturated, it cannot respond any further to the brightness, what happens is the center of the image, where it's brightest, just plain becomes white or yellowish or something. In the case of a red light, the very center of the image is overexposed. If the light had been even brighter than it was, it would be just plain pure white here. But you can know that this is a red light, aside from the fact that we know the guy was filming the plane and there's a red light on the top. Even if somebody hadn't told me that, I would have said, this is a photograph of a red light. Because out here in this fringe area, there is red, the true color shows up. That's because light diffuses sideways within the film, and eventually the intensity diminishes to the point where the film can give the true color rendition. So looking at this picture, we know that it was a red light because there's a red haze around it. Now, the center of that image, as I said, was overexposed and very bright. If you were to believe the airplane beacon hypothesis, then you would say, here's an image which is overexposed and white. It should be red around the outside, but it isn't. I'll show that to you again. There's no redness there. The hypothetical explanation is this beacon flashing, as it were, once per second, reflected off the propellers, and the cameraman was there looking for something to film because the people had seen something out in front of the aircraft, and they had a radar target right in front of the aircraft. And so the hypothetical explanation is the cameraman, instead of looking straight out the aircraft, looked to the right and looked out this window, and he saw the red light from the beacon reflected off these propellers and photographed in the direction of the propeller, thereby getting a reddish pulsation. Mr. Class, in all sincerity, or all something rather, emphasized that in his 1983 book and said that I was ridiculous for refusing to accept that as a possible explanation as opposed to the UFO hypothesis, as it were. But the real ridiculousness is with Mr. K. I spent several years, many hundreds of pages of letters trying to explain to him the plain physical fact, and even did photographic experiments to show that when you photograph a red light, if you get an overexposed image, you get a red haze around the outside, just as that shows. And therefore, this thing right here, for example, which is one of the other little triangular images, or the big bright one that I showed you before, is not a picture of that flashing red beacon on the top. As a matter of fact, there'd be no way that you could get a triangular image of that beacon. That beacon is just a single red light. So this thing is some unidentified object that was out in front of the aircraft